Nazim Sadykhov vs. Nikolas Motta was the 2025 UFC Fight of the Year for all of 1 week. Joshua Van vs. Brandon Royval, the fight of the night from UFC 317 Topuria vs. Oliveira on June 21, 2025, was also the definition of a banger, but this was a much more evenly matched contest between a much higher caliber of fighter who displayed great technique with crisp and sharp technical striking. The action may have been about equal, but the skill level was higher here, and the stakes were a lot greater, with both fighters pouring their heart out to try to earn the right to challenge the winner of the UFC flyweight title match between Alexandre Pantoja and Kai Kara-France that was following them. Van is arguably the most exciting up-and-coming fighter in the UFC. Training for just 5 years, the 23-year-old has amassed an 8-1 record in the UFC in 2 very active years. The 12th ranked flyweight broke his toe en route to finishing Bruno Silva 4 minutes into the third on June 7th, exactly 3 weeks before he stepped in to face the #1 contender and former title challenger Royval on short notice when Manel Kape broke his foot. Van doesn't fight like a young fighter. He's calm, composed, and patient. Royval couldn't pressure him into a mistake, despite keeping an insane pace and showing great footwork to just keep resetting and coming at Van relentlessly, with more leads and combos. Van's shot selection was fantastic. Royval's corner said Van could only counter the left hand, but to me it was more that Van took what Royval was giving to him without hesitation, and landed back with a lot greater accuracy and power. Van did a great job of countering Royval's main weapon, the left jab, with his own right hook, and of targeting the body, connecting on 37 of 43. Royval was the one that dictated the range and tempo. His victories are often through breaking the opponent down. He has the utmost confidence in his cardio, and fought pedal to the metal from start to finish. This seemed like a good strategy against a short-notice opponent who spent the last month figuring out how to make weight twice, but Van attempted more strikes each round, averaging almost 104. Van's only loss came to Charles Johnson on July 13, 2024, another high-quality fight well worth checking out. Johnson had a 5-inch reach advantage, and Royval, with his 3-inch reach advantage, clearly took note. Royval's primary goal was to utilize his jab to keep Van out of range. Whatever damage he did with the jab was secondary to distance control. Van doesn't really have much head movement, but while Royval consistently peppered him with flush jabs, Van realized he could absorb these if he had to, and land back harder. Though getting your nose popped repeatedly isn't the best strategy, a clean solid power hook is worth a lot more than a straight that's largely just tapping to maintain range. Van also knows that he hits hard enough to make his opponent adjust to what he's doing. To an extent, Royval fought an odd fight where he was increasingly closing the distance on the shorter fighter, but that was largely in response to losing these jab for power exchanges. On the inside, he had more options to use hooks and knees to counter Van's counterattack, and perhaps swing the exchange back in his favor. It was nonetheless surprising that after Royval had 3 takedowns against Tatsuro Taira in his last fight, he didn't even attempt one here. Daniel Cormier stated pre-fight that the key to Van's strategy would be defending takedowns. While Royval's previous high was 1 takedown in several fights, the key stat is that 4 of Royval's 7 UFC wins are by submission. While Van proved capable of defending takedowns and getting back up consistently against Ray Saruya, a junior Olympian and world championship Greco-Roman competitor, Van's ground game is untested at best, and certainly nowhere near the level of his striking game. I think Royval had to at least make him consider wrestling to help open up the rest of his game. Royval has a lot of creativity on his feet, but we didn't see as much of it here because he spent the early portion fighting to negate Van, and Van didn't react by getting reckless. I'm certainly not complaining we got more action instead though, and definitely 779 combined strikes thrown with 0 takedown attempts is the sort of fight most people want to see. The first round was good, but not great. Royval was more or less point fighting, very reliant on the jab, and mixing in low kicks when he could. Since Royval's primary goal initially was to just keep Van out of range, whatever damage he did with the jab and low kick was secondary to distance control. Van didn't try to match his volume, but he was incredibly accurate and landed hard. Van may not have avoided Royval's jab that well, but at least he didn't bite on it. He was willing to eat it in order to land a bigger counter, and these right hook counters to Royval's jab were money. Van landed 2/3 of his shots, and they connected solidly. Van's power and precision really made Royval question his strikes, because while Royval's jab was on point, he was still losing the exchanges. Royval had to engage in more of a dogfight because he wasn't able to defend enough of Van's counters to win by just staying out of reach. Royval may have been content to touch Van with the jab, but he threw with a lot more conviction when he was trying to counter Van's attack. His willingness to close the distance and stay in the pocket trying to win the exchanges is what made the second and third rounds classics. Royval has much better head movement than Van, but Van was able to negate that somewhat by targeting the body once he got into range. That was one of the big keys to his accuracy, with Van outlanding Royval to the body and the leg. Both fighters really began opening up a minute into the second round after a first round that was somewhat feeling out, and many of these subsequent exchanges were producing at least one notable strike. This may have started a little tepid, but was an intense, really high-level fight with small margins that escalated quickly after the first round due to Royval's newfound willingness to exchange on the inside and even close the distance on his own. The next two rounds were fireworks. Van was increasingly willing to walk through Royval's jab, coming forward a lot more in the second half to much better results, while Royval also became willing to close the distance. Whenever one fighter did something good, the other stepped right up to answer back. The pace seemed to increase with each minute. They upped the number of strikes they threw each round, Royval throwing 116, 174, then 177, while Van threw 79, 106, and 120. Suddenly, 14 minutes into the fight, Van discovered the oblique kick and used 3 in a row. Van was timing it when Royval stepped forward, and even knocked him off his feet with it. Royval's knee may have been screwed up from this. He seemed to be limping a little when he got back up. The knee also buckled when Van landed his big overhand right that knocked Royval down, although arguably that could just have been his body reacting to the massive impact of the punch. This was such a huge clutch knockdown because the outcome of the fight was very much in doubt with 10 seconds left. I'm not sure Van gets this knockdown without having landed the side kicks, but I'm certain the final seconds were key to the legacy of the fight. Before that, the fight had the consistency, but lacked the drama and big moments to really put it over the top into the elite level of fights. You could basically argue for any scoring. Royval was the ring general. He was ridiculously unendingly active, dictating the pace and range, and had more volume. That was negated by Van landing heavier and being far more accurate. Both fighters did what they did incredibly well though, and neither fighter was able to slow the other down. I thought Van won the first and Royval won the second. The only clear round was the third though, but that wasn't clear until the final 10 seconds, at which point scoring the otherwise close third for Van became obvious. Van scoring the only knockdown put the definitive stamp on him doing more damage, not that there was really much doubt just from seeing how each fighter's body absorbed the blows. The way Royval fought in the second and third rounds, especially after sustaining concussions in his last two fights, showed an insane desire to win. Van making this turnaround, injured and against such a huge step up in competition, was even more amazing. Given the circumstances, people would have been very impressed with Van had he just kept up with Royval for the duration. The fact that he won in a unanimous decision, 29-28, 29-28, even 30-27 on one card, probably jumps him over Manel Kopp and rushes him into a title shot against Pantoja he shouldn't be ready for yet. But after the way Van answered the call tonight, you can't outright dismiss him even against the second best flyweight in history after Mighty Mouse. Flyweight is the best division in MMA right now, and this was an all-time great flyweight fight. Excellent match.